So, well, viewers, I want you to look at your screens now and look at this child with the bones evident, protruding, clothes torn and muscles barely holding the body together. Well, this is an image of a child that represents the state of affairs during the Royal Bengal Famine in 1943, which was, of course, caused by the British. Next up, this is an image that represents the dynamics of the British administration and people at the time. As the citizens sit on the floor with clothes torn and bodies dying of hunger, the Britishers are just standing behind them and can be visibly seen well-dressed, well-fed, indicating how the dearth of resources has impacted only one group and certainly not the other. Well, women and children can also be seen in this next shot, sitting outside in the open, perhaps in the hope of finally gaining access to the resources that they remain far away from. They can be seen wearing less clothes with barely any fat or even rather skin on their limbs, indicating the scale of starvation that loomed over Bengal. Another devastating visual where a woman can be seen feeding her child. One can even see the rib cages of both the individuals in the photographs, indicating once again immense poverty and impoverishment. In the next one, you can see scores of children sitting together, all naked, with barely any mass or volume on their bodies. At an age where the body needs the most amount of nutrition for growth, children can be seen desperately in need of even the most basic of amenities, with desperation glimmering in their eyes for mere survival. Another visual depicting a family from Bengal where you can evidently see lack of nourishment through the dearth of clothes worn by the family. Viewers, I want you to observe the sheer deprivation under which the families functioned at the time and the lack of resources available for even survival, leave alone growing up. Next one, scores of people line up to get even the most essential of supplies. This image, taken from an elevated point, reflects the queues of people who would line up to acquire, get their hands on all that they could in order to sustain themselves and make it to the next day. Another image representing queues of people, women in this case, that seemed to have lined up to get their hands on whatever resources they could deem possible. Remember, viewers, this was a time of not only sheer dearth, but also of rising inflation, where the price of rice itself saw a 300% to 400% increase. Mind you, this is not something the poor people can in any manner possibly support. Moving on, a devastating visual from Bengal where you can see mothers holding their dead newborns. Truly a heart-wrenching, a gutting image. One cannot even begin to fathom or understand what must be in fact going on in the minds of these mothers struggling to feed their babies and themselves in such a challenging time. Next is, of course, a group of people sitting out in the open where you can see a little child sitting in despair in front with hair uncombed. The body is, of course, once again deprived of any nutrition whatsoever. The child sits in front of a crowd, possibly waiting to be provided with essential resources. These visuals, however graphic, still fall short in making us understand what the people who died in the famine may have actually endured. Now, moving on, that we have an understanding of what Bengal looked like at the time, it is important for us to now point fingers at all those who were responsible for making Bengal look the way it did back then. Well, during the Bengal famine, Reginald Maxwell functioned in the capacity of the home member. So Jeremy Riceman as the finance member, so Richard as the commerce member, and Sir Henry Twynham as the supply member. So Bertrand Glancy as the defense member, so Firoz Khan as the Indian Railways member, and C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer as the Indian member, Education, Health and Lands. Viewers, remember these names. These are the people that either directly or indirectly lie behind the Bengal famine in 1943, the famine that killed as many as 4 million people. However, out of all these names, while pointing fingers, if there is one name that comes at the top, then it has to be, of course, of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at that point in time. The man on your screens not only inflicted barbarity but also attributed the same to the Indians themselves. Winston Churchill also gave a series of statements against Indians. He said, and I quote, "I hate Indians. Indians, they are beastly people with a beastly religion," unquote. On repeated occasions, Churchill, whose barbarity knew no bounds, equated the lives of Indians to those of rabbits that bred rapidly. On one occasion, he went as far as saying that the lives of sturdy Greek matter way more than the lives of millions of Bengalis that were starving. Even when conscience-stricken British officials raised the plight of people, an indifferent Churchill only responded with a question asking why Gandhi hadn't died yet. One of the main causes of the famine was the forcible shift to tracts of land to opium, causing peasants to shift from food crops towards opium, thus placing the interest of the British over that of the peasants and, of course, the Indians. A memo in the Sherwell paper indicates a deliberate and conscious denial of resources. And according to the memo, the total wheat harvest in the British Empire at the end of the 1943-44 harvest year was 29 million tons. A staggering quantity, most of which the War Cabinet wanted to hold as a strategic reserve for the future. Further, the lack of food or availability declined, as was argued by Amartya Sen, is evident by the fact that the British administration continued to command enough ships to transport grain around the world. And in 1943, the UK imported 26 million tons of food and raw materials for its civilian population alone, creating a stockpile of 18.5 million tons by the end of that year, the largest in its history. While Indians were dying, fighting for the British Army, fighting wars, enduring challenges and risking their lives, the British administration seemed to be rewarding them with a famine, with nothing but plight, holding neither any consideration nor any recognition of the devastation that it had inflicted upon millions of people. This continued. Keeping these factors and Churchill's barbaric, inhuman policies and statements in mind, it would be nothing but grave injustice for us to not term the famine as genocide. As conscious citizens, with the benefit of retrospect, it is our moral and conscious responsibility to condemn what prevailed in Bengal in the 1940s. We at NewsX would like to put certain demands forth. We request the government of India to declare the famine as a genocide and set up a museum in Kolkata in remembrance of our people who died. Apart from this, we request curriculums to include chapters on genocide so that generations to come are well aware of what went down in 1943. We also urge the UNHRC to declare the deaths of genocide via resolution further. We also urge for the guilty to be held accountable and an investigation to be set up to identify the capability of Winston Churchill. We'll talk about this with our guest joining us on the show. Is Ambassador Bhaspati Mukherjee, former diplomat. Mr. Chandrachud Ghosh, author and historian, also joins us on the show to talk about this demand that NewsX is making. Ambassador Mukherjee, I'll begin with you, ma'am. You know, to add insult to injury, ma'am, the British till date don't recognize what happened in Bengal as something which was man-made. They consider it to be a natural phenomena which was perpetrated or perhaps precipitated by the inadequacies of management which prevailed in India at that point in time. And to add further insult to injury, ma'am, you know, there were debates in English shows as well. You know, a number of anchors went on to say, if Winston Churchill had not done this, he would have lost the war against Germany. This is exactly what Piers Morgan also said in one of his debates, and it was necessary. Would India rather be under Nazi Germany or lose a few million people to sustain its freedom? How do you respond to these callous statements, you know, and this indifferent attitude which prevails to this day?
Well, in the first place, Vineet, I would like to congratulate NewsX for this initiative and to say that it was 10 million people. And I have written at length in my book on the Bengal partition, the untold story, including a separate chapter on genocide and colonial politics is what it's called. I would first like to point out that it was not just man-made, it was strategically man-made. Why do I say that? Because Bengal that year had a bumper harvest. The food was shipped off to soldiers in other parts of the empire or to fight the enemies of the allies. And in Bengal itself, the fishermen were deprived of their boats. Their boats were broken or taken away from them. They were not allowed to ferry back and forth. And it is only when women in desperation uh, somehow managed to reach Kolkata, and then many started dropping dead on the streets of Kolkata, thereby disturbing the mental harmony of the British Indian Army soldiers and officers posted there, who started uh, agitating, asking what is happening, that the British realized first that they would need to get all these starving, dying people out of Kolkata ASAP, which they did, and then finally, the Viceroy asked for food aid, which was refused, as you rightly pointed out, by Winston Churchill, who famously said that that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it himself, is one of his quotations. And he also said, I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. This is taken from original sources. Uh, Even then, at some point, the US president offered food aid through Britain, because we were a colony, to Bengal, and this was rejected 3 times by Churchill. So the point here was that the British strategy was to starve Bengal, to cause an artificial famine. Never mind if 10 million Bengalis who breed like rabbits die in the process, so that when the Japanese, if they cannot check the Japanese advance from Burma across the Burmese Bengal border, the Japanese would be left with no food, with no resources, etc. And it would be easier for the British Indian Army to take them on. It was what is called a strategic decision. That is to say, the British took a strategic decision to starve to death 10 million Bengalis to win World War II. Now, in today's world, if this is said in black and white on television channels across the world, there would be shock, because so many people, including in India, including in North India, don't know about it. Because when my book got published, so many North Indian friends called me up to say that they were completely shell-shocked. They thought that Bengal had a problem with its agriculture. And I explained to them that until the British colonized Bengal, Bengal was the bread bowl of the whole of India. That there were no famine. When there was famine, an occasional famine, let's say under even Mughal times, the tribute was always reduced. Whereas in the case of the Brits, right from the 1777 onwards, if there was a famine-like situation because of failure of the monsoons, the then East India Company would triple the tribute. And then, as you rightly pointed out, they imposed a permanent settlement. They insisted that the Bengali farmer grow opium. They did not allow the farmer to grow any food for himself or his family. As a result of which, starving and homeless, they came to Kolkata, and then they were inveigled into these boats, which is the subject matter of the book I've just written, on indenture, on the ships, carrying them inexorably to other lands to take over the slave labor, because around the same time, slavery had been abolished, sugar plantations had fallen silent, and Indian slaves were required to run them. So on one hand, you had enforced an artificial famine in Bengal, and on the other, you had the impoverishment of the entire eastern part of India, so that there could be easy labor found, which would be a substitute for slave labor. Not a very pretty story, Vineet, and it's time that the whole world woke up to it.
Absolutely right, ma'am. Valid and good points that you have made. Mr. Chandrachud Ghosh, your thoughts on this very sensitive topic. Throughout the world, there have been dictators, there have been leaders who have been, awarded capital punishment for causing famines. But when it comes to Winston Churchill and the apathy of the British, forget about reparations. There's not also an admission that comes out. When we speak of a genocide, I'm calling it a genocide because that's exactly what it is when it comes to a genocide like this.
It was a genocide. It was definitely a case of genocide. As ma'am very correctly described, that it was a strategic decision that led to it. But the point is that where is the question of reparation or where is the question of apology? Because nobody has demanded it. First, we need to demand. First, we need to make them responsible. And quite on the contrary, we find that the Gandhian leadership in the Congress party at that time was going and dying to rub their shoulders with Winston Churchill, getting their photos clicked, because they were the upholders of democracy. There was an imaginary enemy of Germany and Japan that was the bogey of the Axis power was raised to scare Indians and sing along with the story. This story that if Britain was defeated, then Germany and Japan would occupy India and they would be far worse than the British Empire, was a creation of Winston Churchill himself. He passed the story through certain contacts in India, and the intellectual circles in India at that time bought it. But as later investigations, research by various institutions, and even the British military itself shows that Japan had no intention to occupy India. There was absolutely no intention. And the interesting bit is that when Bengal was going through this famine situation, famine condition, and quite late in the day when the British government itself had estimated, or not the British government, but the British Indian government, the Viceroy and his Executive Council, they had estimated in late 1943 that there was a shortage of around 1.4 million tons of food grain. From the other side, from the Japanese, with the Japanese help, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose offered to start sending shipments of rice. One of the factors that caused panic here was the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, and India used to import about 1 to 2 million tons of food grains from Burma, primarily rice, and that was cut off. So that created a problem. And when Netaji reached Southeast Asia, and when he was informed about this famine situation, he offered to start sending shipments of rice, starting with a lakh ton of rice. The British Indian government never acknowledged, far from responding. He had offered that I will start with 1 lakh tons of rice, and if you accept, I will keep sending rice. But there was no reciprocation, neither from the British Indian government nor from the Indian leaders. Of course, I mean, I can't blame the Indian leaders at that time because they were in jail. But this whole thing actually did not happen overnight. It was a build-up. It was a consequence of the wartime policies of the British Indian government, the Viceroy, his Executive Council, the Home Government in London, which was led by Winston Churchill. So a number of things happened. They came together. So, for example, because India became the largest supplier to the British war effort, it required resources, and it didn't have the money to provide those resources. It started printing. That led to a huge inflation. Now, huge inflation meant that the value of the rupee was going down drastically. And the farmers, particularly in Punjab, they were doubtful of the value of the rupee. They started refusing to sell wheat. So that kind of thing started happening. Then, of course, which ma'am referred to the scorched earth policy. The British were afraid that the Japanese would attack India. And since they did not have enough military power at that time, they started, destroying crops and boats. Boats were the most important means of transport in rural Bengal. So you destroy boats in rural Bengal at that time. Now, of course, we are talking about 80 years later. It is difficult to understand, but still boats play a huge role now, even now. So imagine what it was at that time. So they started destroying boats, which destroyed the livelihoods of the fisher folk. There was no way to go into the rivers and get food, get fish, catch their fish. There was no way to transport food grains through the river channels. The Along with that, rice and other food grains were destroyed. They were thrown into water. Then there was a huge cyclone in October that that killed nearly 30,000 people and destroyed nearly 20% of the standing crop. So all these things came together, and then the British decision to cut down shipping in the Indian Ocean region and send that shipping power to the Atlantic, so that the UK could stockpile food grains. They already had surplus stock, but still they wanted more and more and more. And Churchill wanted to send food to the southeastern Europe so that he could fight with the Nazi Germany. So India did not feature in his plan at all, because India were, for him, in his scheme of things, Indians were subhumans. But when India became independent, and let me tell you that this was the beginning of the misfortune of India in near about the times of our independence. Because this famine, which devastated the economy of the countryside of Bengal, was immediately followed within a few years by the partition of the province. And that dealt a death blow to the economy, culture, every aspect of life. That province was devastated. So this misfortune, there is a story of how the empire destroyed the most productive and affluent province of the country,
All right.
which gave birth to the nationalism in India.
Right. Good points, Mr. Ghosh. Mr. Arnab Dey, Indian novelist, is also joining us on the broadcast. Arnab, appreciate you joining us. Well, you looked at the documented images of the famine in Bengal. What more can we imagine that these people must have gone through? Because obviously, these pictures don't do much.
You can imagine it by reading some of the literature that was produced around that time in Bengali, which has a fairly detailed description of what people went through, because it was very much part of people's lived memories. I mean, my grandfather, who's no longer with us now, told me the stories of what happened and what he saw. So maybe it's not that well known outside Bengal, because I don't think there's a lot of English literature or Hindi literature about this, but there's a lot of Bengali writing around the 1950s when people still remembered what they had seen.
Arnab, why do you think that the Indian government has not declared the Bengal famine a genocide? Why should this be done, according to you?
Well, I think one of the main reasons is we've had how to put it, we've kind of never really come out of our colonial mindset. I mean, it takes many generations to do the deprogramming of 200 years of colonialism. So we believe, and it is actually belief rather than the truth, is that the British rule was actually good for us. So even though we are independent, the British did a lot of good things for us. Is a commonly uttered refrain, and even some of our leaders have said it at different points of time. And any kind of fact that runs counter to this narrative is essentially ignored, I would say. So this level of genocide, it was, again, rather than blaming the British, I would more blame Winston Churchill, because there were many British officials who actually protested and wrote letters of outrage about what was going on. It was primarily the brainchild of the extremely racist and India-hating Winston Churchill. So more than the British, actually, and of course, this was a concomitant of British imperialism, so Britain has to take some of the blame, but it was more one person than the system, I would say.
Okay, Arnab, another interesting question would be, is Churchill's Bengal genocide any different from what Hitler did to the Jews in the Holocaust?
No, it wasn't, actually. And that's the thing. I mean, there was Stalin and Stalin's genocide. And remember, this strategy of the scorched earth strategy, which was really what happened. So for those of you who don't know, what happened was that there was enough grain in Bengal to feed the population. It wasn't as if there was drought. what Churchill did, and again, when I say Churchill, maybe Churchill and a few other people, was they wanted to replicate the scorched earth tactics that Stalin applied to the Germans in Russia at that point of time, which was when the Germans, as part of Operation Barbarossa, when they marched into Russia after they had a pact.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.